The Vikings remain etched into history as both explorers and terror-bringers. They sailed across seas, raided monasteries, and carved their place in legend. Yet, among the tales of their brutality, none is more infamous than the dreaded blood eagle. The blood eagle was not just a method of execution. It was a spectacle, a statement of dominance and divine retribution. The very name conjures images of agony, power, and ritual. But was it ever truly real, or just a medieval exaggeration? According to sagas and Norse poetry, the execution was performed on enemies of the highest importance. Kings, betrayers, and rivals were said to meet this grisly fate. The ritual elevated cruelty into something symbolic, a punishment that echoed through generations. The process, if accounts are to be believed, began with the victim tied down. Warriors would split the ribs from the spine, peeling them outward to form grotesque wings. The lungs would then be pulled out, left hanging, fluttering in the cold northern air. Such imagery is horrifying even today, but for the Vikings it may have carried sacred meaning. The eagle was a creature tied to Odin, the All-Father, god of war and wisdom. Performing the blood eagle could have been a sacrificial act, offering the victim's life directly to the divine. The ritual is described in several Old Norse texts. One of the most cited is the Orkneyinga saga, which tells how Earl Torf Einar executed Halfdan Longleg by carving an eagle on his back. Another comes from the tale of King Ella of Northumbria, said to have been given the blood eagle, after killing the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar's sons, burning with vengeance, supposedly captured Ella and subjected him to the gruesome ritual. The saga writers describe the procedure as slow, deliberate, and drenched in symbolism. Ella's suffering was not just punishment, it was theatre, a divine reckoning. Yet modern historians argue over whether this was ever possible. The anatomical details of splitting ribs and pulling lungs outward while the victim remained alive sound medically improbable. Some argue it was metaphorical, an eagle carved into the back, not a literal lung display. The debate fuels fascination. Was it exaggerated poetry, meant to glorify Viking vengeance, or did Norse warriors truly have the skill and cruelty to attempt such a feat? The sagas are part myth, part history, blurring the line between fact and horror. Still, for the people of the Viking Age, the mere idea of the blood eagle struck fear. Even if symbolic, the threat carried weight. Enemies believed defiance could mean not just death, but a soul offering to Odin in the most agonizing manner imaginable. Consider the psychological power of such a tale. In a world where honor and reputation defined survival, the rumor of a fate worse than death could bend entire kingdoms to fear. Whether true or not, the blood eagle worked as terror propaganda. But Viking executions were never just about punishment. They were performances meant for an audience. Warriors, chiefs, and even slaves would witness such spectacles, embedding loyalty through horror. Pain became a language of authority. The Norse themselves lived in a brutal world. Blood feuds, raids, and vengeance shaped their daily lives. Death was not hidden away. It was public, violent, and often ritualized. Against this backdrop, the blood eagle feels disturbingly plausible. Some scholars suggest the ritual was a form of drap, a killing that doubled as poetic justice. The victim's lungs, flaring outward like wings, symbolized freedom through death. To die this way was humiliation, but also transformation into a cursed symbol. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an English source, mentions Ella's execution but does not describe the blood eagle. This silence deepens the mystery. Did Viking writers invent the ritual later, weaving mythology into vengeance? Or did English chroniclers choose to omit such savagery out of disbelief? Medieval Christian writers often demonized pagans, exaggerating their rituals. The blood eagle could have been a way to frame Vikings as godless monsters. Yet the detail in Norse sources makes it harder to dismiss as mere invention. Imagine the scene if it did occur. The chanting of warriors, the smell of iron and blood, the screams echoing across fjords. A leader's death, not quick, not merciful, but turned into a symbol of divine wrath. The terror would linger longer than the victim's life. Some anatomical studies have attempted reconstructions. Splitting the ribs from the spine is technically possible, though survival beyond the first cuts would be brief. The act of pulling lungs outward, however, stretches credibility. Death would arrive too quickly for such a display. But history is not always about medical possibility. It is about what people believed. If the Vikings believed the blood eagle was real, then in their minds it existed as surely as their gods and prophecies. Belief itself was power, was. For those who heard the stories, especially enemies across the seas, the message was chilling. To cross the sons of Ragnar, to betray a Viking chief, was to risk a fate that mocked both body and spirit. The eagle of Odin would take its due. And so, the legend of the blood eagle spread. In mead halls and across battlefields, the tale was told and retold, each version more dramatic than the last, ensuring that memory of the ritual outlived even the Vikings themselves. To uncover the truth of the blood eagle, one must enter the world of the sagas. These texts, written centuries after the Viking Age, mix history with poetry, myth, and political propaganda. The sagas were not cold records, but stories designed to inspire awe, loyalty, and fear. One of the earliest references comes from the tale of Ragnar's sons. After Ragnar Lothbrok was executed by King Ella of Northumbria, his sons invaded England. The saga claims Ella was captured and subjected to the blood eagle, his ribs split, his back torn open, his lungs exposed to the sky. But there is a problem. The saga was written long after the events it describes, by Christian scribes who may have exaggerated pagan cruelty. They shaped these tales for audiences who loved drama, vengeance, and symbolism. Truth was often secondary to legend. Some historians argue the term blood eagle was misunderstood. In Old Norse, the phrase may have meant something more symbolic, perhaps carving an eagle figure on a victim's back with a blade. This interpretation strips away the medical impossibility and leaves a ritual carving, still brutal but far less fantastical. Others, however, believe the sagas meant exactly what they described. Viking executions were not meant to be merciful. If a victim could be half dismembered to send a message, why would Norse warriors hesitate? To them, cruelty was a weapon of power. Archaeology has added fuel to the debate. Some Viking skeletons show signs of rib injuries consistent with opening the chest cavity. While not definitive proof, these discoveries hint that such practices might have been attempted. Yet, none confirm the lungs being pulled out in the ritual's final stage. Medical experts weigh in with skepticism. The moment ribs are severed from the spine, massive blood loss and shock would likely kill the victim within minutes. The dramatic vision of lungs fluttering in the open air may have been poetic exaggeration rather than biological possibility. Still, one must remember that Norse culture thrived on poetry and symbolism. Skaldic verses often spoke in riddles and metaphors. To carve the blood eagle may have been a poetic way to describe killing someone brutally and dishonorably, not a literal medical description. Yet the image refuses to die. Medieval authors relished retelling the blood eagle, each version more gruesome than the last. To them, the Vikings embodied raw barbarity. By preserving this tale, they made pagan cruelty an eternal reminder of Christian superiority. For the Norse themselves, the ritual had a darker layer of meaning. The eagle was a carrion bird, feeding on corpses. To carve an eagle on one's back could mean condemning the victim's soul to be devoured. In a society obsessed with afterlife and honor, this was the ultimate insult. It is also possible that the blood eagle was reserved for betrayers. The sagas often connect it to vengeance killings, especially when a leader or family member had been dishonored. The punishment was not random, but ritual, a performance of justice before gods and men. Imagine Ragnar's sons avenging their father. They needed not only to kill Ella, but to do so in a way that echoed through history. A simple execution would not suffice. The blood eagle, real or imagined, became their eternal curse upon a king who dared slay their father. The Christian scribes who recorded these stories likely amplified the brutality. To them, Vikings were godless pagans whose cruelty needed no limits. Writing of the blood eagle reinforced the view that heathens were savages desperately in need of Christian salvation. But what if some version of it truly happened? Ritualized torture has existed in many cultures: crucifixion in Rome, flaying in Mesoamerica, impalement in the Ottoman Empire. The Vikings would hardly be unique in turning death into a spectacle. What sets the blood eagle apart is its theatricality. It was not just about killing, but about making the body itself into a symbol. Wings spread, lungs pulled outward, the victim transformed into an offering to Odin or a grotesque warning to all who looked on. Some sagas describe victims enduring the pain without crying out. This detail was crucial. If a man endured the blood eagle in silence, his honor remained intact, and he might reach Valhalla. If he screamed, his soul was shamed. Pain was not only punishment, it was a test of dignity. This suggests the blood eagle, whether literal or symbolic, was part of a ritual of honor. It tested the victim's worth even in death. The execution became both humiliation and opportunity, the chance to prove one's courage in the face of unbearable agony. Still doubt lingers. Scholars like Roberta Frank argue the blood eagle never happened as described. To her, it was a later invention, a poetic flourish misunderstood by readers. She believes medieval writers misread metaphors and took them literally, creating a myth that has haunted history. Yet others like Alfred Smith defend its possibility. Smith notes that Viking violence was extreme and Norse rituals often involved blood sacrifice. The blood eagle, no matter how horrific, fits within that cultural framework. Dismissing it as pure invention may underestimate Viking brutality. The truth likely lies in between. The ritual may have been attempted in some form, perhaps not as the sagas describe, but as a symbolic carving that later storytellers exaggerated. The legend grew because it embodied Viking cruelty so perfectly. But whether it happened once, 100 times, or never at all, the blood eagle became real in cultural memory. For centuries, it has remained one of the most infamous images of torture in history, suspended between myth and possibility. And so, the question lingers: was the blood eagle an anatomical reality, or the darkest metaphor to ever emerge from Viking lore? The answer lies not only in bones and texts, but in the power of belief. The blood eagle has endured not because it was proven fact, but because it is unforgettable. The image of ribs spreading like wings and lungs heaving in the cold air strikes at something primal in human imagination. Even as historians debate its truth, the legend continues to thrive. In Viking culture, reputation was as important as wealth. Stories of ruthless vengeance and shocking executions built fear across Europe. If the blood eagle was real, it showed Viking cruelty. If it was a myth, it was even more powerful, a story that terrified without needing proof. The saga of King Ella's death illustrates this perfectly. Whether or not his ribs were truly split, the legend of his execution spread fear across kingdoms. To rulers who faced Viking raids, the very rumor of such torture was enough to discourage resistance. This is the real genius of the blood eagle. It was not just an execution method, it was psychological warfare. The Vikings did not need to perform it often. One story, retold across generations, ensured their enemies trembled at the thought of capture. In this way, the blood eagle was less about anatomy and more about theater. The performance mattered more than the details. Warriors chanting, blades flashing, and an enemy's body transformed into a grotesque symbol of divine justice. This was spectacle designed to echo beyond the battlefield. But the fascination with the blood eagle did not die with the Vikings. Medieval writers seized on it as proof of pagan barbarity. By depicting Norsemen as bloodthirsty heathens, Christian chroniclers reinforced their own moral superiority. To them, the blood eagle was a perfect symbol of godless cruelty. The Renaissance and later centuries revived the tale in literature and art. Writers and scholars, intrigued by the macabre, repeated the story in histories, poems, and plays. Each retelling made the blood eagle darker, grander, and more grotesque. By the 19th century, the blood eagle had become part of Europe's fascination with Viking savagery. Romantic writers painted Norsemen as wild warriors, both admirable and terrifying. The blood eagle became shorthand for ultimate brutality, a ritual that defined the Viking age in imagination. In the modern world, the ritual still holds power. Television shows, novels, and films resurrect it for audiences hungry for dark spectacle. When Ragnar's sons perform the blood eagle in popular series, the screen burns with both horror and awe. Fiction keeps the legend alive. Yet behind the drama lies an uncomfortable truth. Humans have always been drawn to stories of extreme violence. From gladiatorial combat to medieval executions, societies have used brutality as both entertainment and warning. The blood eagle endures because it taps into this eternal fascination. But the question remains, did it truly happen? Historians remain divided. Some insist it was impossible, a literary metaphor twisted by time. Others argue at least one attempt was made, even if the victim died too quickly for the ritual to be completed. Perhaps the most honest answer is that it does not matter. The blood eagle's power lies in its story, not its certainty. Myths, after all, shape culture as much as facts. Whether literal or symbolic, the ritual became real in the minds of those who believed it. Imagine a Viking chieftain telling the tale to his warriors over mead. The details might change with each retelling, but the effect was the same: fear, respect, loyalty. Myths like the blood eagle were as much weapons as swords. Archaeology continues to search for answers. Bones with rib damage raise possibilities, but none have confirmed the full ritual. Still, each discovery reignites debate, keeping the mystery alive. History leaves us just enough evidence to wonder, but never enough to know. Meanwhile, linguists point to poetic metaphors. The Norse loved kennings, riddling phrases that replace direct speech. Carving the eagle could mean killing in battle, with carrion birds feasting on the corpse. Perhaps the blood eagle was never meant to be literal, only poetic. But poetry does not lessen the horror. To the Vikings, words had power. A metaphor could shape reality, and a ritual described in song could become truth in memory. Thus, the blood eagle lives, even if it began as a figure of speech. The ritual's legacy lies in how it blurs the line between history and myth. It challenges us to ask what matters more, the fact of what happened, or the belief in what could have happened. In Viking society, belief was enough to make the blood eagle real. Modern audiences may watch the ritual in fiction and feel detached horror, but for medieval listeners, the story was immediate and terrifying. To them, the Vikings were not distant figures. They were raiders at the shore, enemies who could appear in the night. That is why the blood eagle mattered. It was not a relic of anatomy but of fear. It was a story that traveled faster than ships, a whisper that could weaken enemies before a single blade was drawn. Today, historians continue to argue, and storytellers continue to reimagine. Perhaps the blood eagle was never performed, or perhaps it was tried once, immortalized forever by the horror it created. Either way, its legacy proves stronger than certainty. The blood eagle is a reminder of how myth and history intertwine. It shows us how stories of violence can outlive facts, shaping how we see entire cultures. It proves that cruelty, whether real or imagined, leaves an eternal mark on human memory. And so the blood eagle survives, not in bones, not in proof, but in the imagination of all who hear its tale. It stands as one of history's darkest legends, a ritual that may never have happened, yet refuses ever to die.